Hi, I'm Mark Gaylor. I'm a Sony Imaging Ambassador. It's the start of a new decade, and I think it's a great opportunity to look at what the future may hold, where to from here, so to speak. Now, I have to point out that I don't have 2020 vision. Even though I am a Sony Imaging Ambassador, I get very little to no warning about what new models will be released. So you may ask the question, but if I'm being honest, I simply don't really know what Sony will release in 2020. So this is just me speculating on what I perhaps would like to see appear. Now, some people think that camera sales will continue to decline because the technology has somehow reached maturity. I don't actually know what that means. Now, I've been around since the very first DSLR, and I've never seen the pace of change ever slow down. If anything, it just gets faster and faster. And I know some area of the market will be reduced because of maybe increasing sales in smartphones and increased capability of smartphones, but I believe that there is still huge potential for people to still wanting to own interchangeable lens cameras because they can capture images that simply smartphones are incapable of doing and will probably not be able to achieve even at the end of this decade. So I'm talking about images with quite clear figure ground separation, and I know we have portrait modes in cameras such as an iPhone that allow sort of depth control basically in post-production we separate out and blur the background, but nothing really comes close to a full frame camera using a wide aperture f1.4 prime lens such as what I'm showcasing here. But perhaps maybe with some wide aperture lenses released in the APS-C space such as 1.4 primes, maybe this will give APS-C owners the capability of getting that little bit of figure ground separation that we admire in the full frame cameras. Now, I know other manufacturers are making 1.4 lenses for Sony APS-C cameras, but I would like to see Sony entering this space as well. And there is hope because Sony have released two new APS-C high quality lenses in 2019, and I'm hoping that is just a shape of what is to come in 2020. Now, another area that full frame mirrorless cameras excel in, such as the A9 camera that can shoot at 20 frames per second with blackout free shooting using only the electronic shutter mechanism with no shutter distortion, and matching that again with good quality glass such as the 400mm prime, we get images like this. And again, there's no smartphone that is going to go anywhere near this capability for the foreseeable future. But having said that, the sensor technology in the A9 and A9 II, which is called a stacked backlit illuminated sensor, is actually available in the little pocket RX100. So we can get that 20 frames per second blackout free, distortion free shooting on that little camera. Now, unusually that stack sensor only appears in the A9 and A9 II interchangeable lens cameras, so we certainly have the next generation of sensor sitting in that A9 camera that could be rolled out into maybe the APS-C cameras and also the other full frame cameras. So if we can achieve this with a little RX100, then certainly we can hope that Sony will continue to release that stack sensor into other camera technologies. Now, as I said, I've been around the digital revolution, and the word revolution may lead some people to think that it's just a cycle, and when we get back to the top of that circle it stops, where revolution doesn't really have any end point as far as I'm concerned. Now, I've seen the camera technologies move very quickly, especially when Sony entered the market. Now, we've bumped forward quite a number of years here. Now, Sony actually acquired the Minolta Konica plant in 2006, and they did get some quite impressive technologies such as the steady shot inside, the in-body image stabilization. But I think Sony started pushing really really hard in this interchangeable lens camera space in 2010. We saw the SLT rather than the DSLR, which was a fixed mirror technology. This allowed full-time phase detect autofocus for movies as well as stills with no interruption from a moving mirror. So this was groundbreaking stuff. I think very few people in the industry actually realized where Sony were heading with this technology way back then. I remember Sony getting criticized for the 1/3 of a stop of loss of light through using a fixed mirror, and didn't really see the potential of full-time phase detect autofocus. Now, in the same year, Sony launched their mirrorless NEX cameras, their APS-C cameras. Now the NEX3, the NEX5, and then later the NEX7. Now these had no phase detect autofocus. Sony had some work to do in this space, and that was basically to build phase detect autofocus directly onto the sensors themselves. Now we went full frame in 2013, but I didn't think this was a significant improvement in the technologies at this point, because this camera again featured no phase detect autofocus. We had to wait for the backlit illuminated sensor to enter the full frame market in 2015. In order to achieve both better high ISO performance, better dynamic range, but also that on-sensor phase detect autofocus, and it also gave us 4K movies. And so really we started seeing significant pushes from Sony in that 2015 era, and it was driven by the sensor, not the camera body specifically. Now, probably even more significant than the backlit illuminated sensor coming into the full frame cameras was actually the stacked sensor, that 1-inch stacked sensor that appeared in the RX cameras in 2015. It wasn't until 2017 that we saw it appear in that A9 camera. And again, I think the industry was slow to recognize how fabulous this sensor was, and certainly I appreciated it because I bought the camera, the RX 105, that could shoot 20 frames per second and had phase detect autofocus on the sensor itself, and this image is from that camera. So 2017, a very significant year, because the stacked sensor technology went full frame, skipping the APS-C format entirely and just coming straight into the A9 camera. And why this camera didn't win Camera of the Year, I have no idea. It was quite clearly the most significant push forward of any camera manufacturer during that year. And certainly the camera got better in 2019 with its firmware update, improving the AF tracking algorithms. But I think having a distortion-free camera that could work without the mirror and the shutter mechanism when shooting sports was a significant hurdle that Sony managed to get over in 2017. Now, just to highlight that, I do have a blog post on this subject, but what we can see there is a camera on the left shooting with a silent shooting mode with the electronic shutter, trying to shoot sports, and seeing that golf club bend and bow is the result of using a CMOS sensor, a conventional CMOS sensor that isn't of the stack variety. Basically, the data traffic on that stack sensor is moving 10 times faster than any regular sensor, and this opens up huge capabilities, not just in the sports action market, but if you can move data that quickly, then can you imagine what that would do for movie cameras, for shooting maybe 6K with high frame rates, less compression, because it can move data really quickly. And I suspect for a lot of people who have been waiting for the A7S III, we're going to, in order to leverage that data traffic, I suspect, I don't know, that Sony will elect to put in a stack sensor into that A7S III if and when it appears. There's the distortion comparison that I was talking about, and again you'll be able to see that maybe on my A9 review. Okay, so 2019 we saw the resolution really growing on the R cameras. Now, yes, I know it doesn't have the absolute high ISO performance of the A7R III and the A7 III and the A9 cameras, but remember, this camera is pushing and biting at the heels of medium format cameras that cost way more than this camera. And remember, this camera has phase detect autofocus, a lot of things that the medium format cameras still don't have. So this was a huge jump forward for photographers who actually need that resolution. Now also the A9 II sort of evolved even more to become an even better, more useful tool for pro sports shooters. I remember DP Review saying this was the camera Sony had to make. They didn't make it for you, which meant that it really is a professional tool, and a lot of the incremental improvements improved massively the workflow for pro shooters. But a lot of photographers, amateur photographers specifically, were looking for a high resolution A9, and maybe we'll see that in 2020, 2021, I don't know, but Sony certainly won't want to compromise 20 frames per second blackout free shooting for that higher resolution. So that's something that I dare say Sony will be working on. If we've had the improvement for the R camera and we've had the improvement for the A9, surely 2020 is the year where we will see an A7 IV camera. And a lot of people are speculating, will this be a camera that just evolves slightly, maybe as the A9 evolved to the A9 II, or will we see a revolution? Now again, I don't know the answer to this one, but I'm biting my fingernails waiting to find out, because I think this is a significant point. I would like to think that we will see a revolution continuing rather than just a camera technology evolving, but I don't know. This does, however, pose a little bit of a marketing problem for the suits in Sony, not necessarily the engineers who will be working at breakneck speed to create better and better cameras that give us more creative possibilities for less outlay of money. But if Sony adds more megapixels to the A7 IV, surely that will undermine the A7R III high resolution market. So is this something that Sony are prepared to do, is to cannibalize the sales of the A7R III in order to push out an A7 IV with maybe, let's say 36 megapixels? Like, who would buy a 42.4 megapixel A7R III? I know the A7R IV with its 61 megapixel will probably still have a market for photographers who have only a choice between, say, medium format and a full frame A7R IV. So more megapixels. Will Sony make that move? I'm hoping they will, but I have no idea whether they will. Stack sensor, we haven't seen that in another camera other than the A9. If they put it in an A7 IV and that performance gets close to the A9, will people still buy the A9 camera? Again, this is something that the marketing team behind Sony will probably be arguing as I'm making this movie. But let's hope we do see that stack sensor appear in more interchangeable lens cameras other than just the A9, A9 II. 10-bit movies, 60 frames per second, 4K, A7S III. Now we do see those figures for high bit depth, high frame rate, 4K movies in a pro camcorder like the FS7 Mark II. but will we see it in an A7S III? I would bet that we probably do, and I suspect that we'll be seeing that delivered via a stack sensor. Now, I think the huge delay in the A7S III may have been just because of body designs, of actually getting such a small body movie camera with high capability to work in a cool environment. So there will possibly be cooling systems or a way that the camera can get rid of excess heat so it doesn't shut down every 5 minutes because of those specs that people have requested. Moving on away from the full frame market into the APS-C. Now, we saw significant developments in the Alpha 6400, the 6600, the 6100 camera. They all matured in their AF performance. They all acquired the new AF tracking algorithms. We got the larger Z series or Z series battery in the 6600. We got completely flip up screens. They added audio jacks in the 6600. So we saw certain levels of improvement, but I still think there's room for even more improvement in the APS-C market. For instance, I think the Alpha 6600 was certainly the best APS-C camera Sony have made to date, but I think I could use an APS-C camera with a front dial as well as a rear dial, a USB-C port in the side of the camera rather than the USB 2 port, which is 10 times slower than USB-C, a UHS 2 card slot so we can clear the buffer. When we've been shooting at 8 or 11 frames a second, we can clear that buffer much faster. I'm not too sure why the buffer capacity actually reduced on the 6600 compared to the 6500, so I'd like Sony to push out that buffer capacity over 100 raw images once again. So yes, I would definitely love to see the buffer capacity. So I don't think that everybody has to choose an A9. There is a room for some people to choose a premium APS-C camera to shoot sports, action, birds, etc. I think omitting the AF frame colors, a brighter frame color when we're using the Spot AF would be welcome on an APS-C camera. Maybe even multi-selector or joystick as it's often referred to, and certainly we have opportunity to see that stack sensor coming into the APS-C cameras, because although it's a very good sensor in the APS-C cameras, there is potential to have an even better sensor. Sony are currently making one, so will Sony release it into the APS-C cameras? Maybe not in 2020, but certainly it has to come sooner or later. So at the moment, if Sony were to release, say, an A6800 or A7000 camera in that APS-C lineup with all of those features, we could possibly see a point in time where a premium APS-C camera is actually more expensive than an entry-level full-frame camera. And I think that Sony shouldn't be afraid of doing this. I think there are some people who will pay more for an APS-C camera because of smaller lenses, less physical size, the ability to use a messenger bag rather than a backpack. I think there is a market for a premium level camera. At the moment, the Alpha 6600 is actually getting very close. It's only 10% cheaper than the A7 III, but the A7 III is being discounted, whereas the Alpha 6600 is not at the moment. So I still think there is room to come in slightly less, certainly less than an A7 IV when it appears. So I'm hoping that Sony are going to move into or revisit the APS-C market much more aggressively in 2020. Now, one of the things that I've seen happening in 2019, which I was very excited about, was Sony starting to work with machine learning, or sometimes called AI, artificial intelligence, and we've seen that in the shape of Animal Eye AF in 2019. And certainly this was probably one of the best improvements in camera technologies, not hardware but firmware, giving us capabilities to leverage encourage more performance from our cameras. So the AF tracking was perhaps for me the most significant improvement, and the fact that that was backdated to the A9 camera was a great move on Sony's point. And I'd like to think that Sony will do more back rolling of performance if they can roll it back, because the processors in the cameras can handle the extra algorithms that it's having to deal with in real time. So that AF tracking, this is being highlighted on an Alpha 6400, which has incredible AF tracking capability. I have to say it's probably better than an A7 III, A7R3 camera, and we see that on a well positioned camera in the APS-C lineup. Not that expensive for the AF performance it delivers. The Animal IF, as I've said, we're now seeing on all new cameras being released in 2019, and it was backdated to the A7 III, A7R3 cameras, which was very good for Sony to do that. Obviously it doesn't need as much processing power as maybe the AF tracking algorithms, and so they were able to roll that back. Now one of the things that I would like to see in 2020 that hasn't appeared is what a lot of photographers do in order to reduce noise is having to put the cameras on tripods, having to stack multiple images and post-process them in order to reduce noise. Now we are seeing have seen that happen in smartphone technology, rapid bursts of shots, and we see those rapid bursts of shots on a camera like the RX107 shooting at 90 frames per second, and then basically a camera processing power working out what is subject, what is noise, and reducing that noise very intelligently in camera. So cameras, instead of producing images looking like they were shot at ISO 6400, look like they were shot at ISO 400. Now I think I'd would love to see those technologies starting to appear in interchangeable lens cameras as well. One of the other things that I would also like to see happening is the depth control. Now, depth control is being supported by post-production software like Lightroom, so you don't have to do it on a phone. You could, as long as you record the depth information in the EXIF information of the file, you can then start to modify the background in terms of color, tone, and also blur. And this allows people with smaller sensors to emulate the shallow depth of field that comes from using a prime, wide aperture prime on a full frame camera. What I would really like Sony to be able to do in the coming year or so is certainly work in that APS-C area in order to try and chase the performance that people generally only have seen in their full frame market. Now, this is a difficult area for Sony to have to make the decision. Do they cannibalize sales in the full frame in order to grow market sales in APS-C? I'm wanting to think that Sony won't hold back, because my experience over 30 years in digital imaging is the companies that do hold back will suffer economically from other companies that don't. And so I would like to think Sony keep ahead of the game by never holding back, never having any fear of cannibalizing sales of more premium cameras, because they can make more affordable cameras achieve those goals. Some of the other things that I would like machine learning to be able to give users of interchangeable lens cameras is more heads-up information when working. Like a lot of people who miss shots or miss focus or don't have enough depth of field to cover a large group of people because their experience levels don't tell them that they need to stop down 2 more f-stops in order to get sufficient depth of field. What's to say the camera couldn't give you that information live as a heads-up display while working? Now, if you're used to seeing multiple face detect areas around multiple faces, which is current technology, what's to say that the camera couldn't then say, if you want both of these faces sharp, you're going to need to stop that f1.8 lens down to f5.6. Or you're going to have to move back, and then I'm going to showcase that both faces are now sharp. Okay, so this would be very useful, basically giving more skills or more information so that more novice users can achieve better or a more successful hit rate of successful images. So this also goes for landscape photographers as well. I often see novice photographers stopping down to f22 to get depth of field and then compromising their images because of image diffraction, which obviously it would have been better, sharper image had they just kept it open at f8 or f11. So having a hyperfocal distance calculator working where you could nominate the subject in the distance, the subject in the foreground, and then the camera says whether you need f8, f11 or f16 to achieve that depth of field required to shoot this. And I think I would pay for this even though I'm experienced, and I'm sure a lot of casual users of these interchangeable lens cameras would certainly upgrade to get these technologies. So we saw HDR, multiple shots bracketed to get the dynamic range. Now certainly on a camera like the A7R4 we have a huge dynamic range, but what's to say that we couldn't get close to that dynamic range in an APS-C camera just by bracketing a series of images and then having the camera process that data in camera and then save a RAW file, not a JPEG, to the card. Now a program like Lightroom is able to bracket raw images and produce a raw DNG file after it's finished doing that. What's to say that we can't do that in camera as well with a little bit more processing power added to our cameras? One of the things that I've certainly spent hundreds and hundreds of dollars on buying ND filters to create slow shutter speed to calm busy waters or choppy waters. What's to say that we can't add ND filters in camera? Now this could be done via firmware or it could be done by physical ND filters behind the lens, actually in the camera body. It's certainly going to be a more affordable place to put one set of ND filters in a camera rather than buying ND filters for all of our lenses. It would certainly save photographers hundreds, possibly even thousands of dollars over the years to come if we think logically about where is the best place to put ND filters. And we certainly see that now on pro camcorders, that we can have the ability to dial in an ND filter to suit to optimize the perfect shutter speed when shooting movies. And if stills photographers got that capability for their very long exposures, then certainly this would be an advantage rather than carrying a kit of ND filters. I certainly know that my ND filter kit for my 12-24 Sony lens is possibly over a kilo just in the filter kit alone, so I would certainly value built-in ND filters in a camera body. Long exposure assistant, when we're doing these long exposures and we're trying to calculate whether it's a minute or 90 seconds we need, this has appeared in other cameras where we can actually see the exposure building up on the screen. So when we're using a remote release, we can actually say, actually 70 seconds is cooked enough and I can end the exposure now, because if I carry on exposing any longer, then I'm going to overexpose the highlights. And again, this would be a killer feature to see appear in new interchangeable lens cameras. I've talked about stacking and bracketing HDR images. How about stacking focus for macro shooters? Again, we mount the camera, or maybe even handheld, and then in-camera alignment of images, and then shoot maybe 6-7 images, and then have the camera build a deeper depth of field using those exposure brackets. Now, the Bayer sensor technology that we've been using for a very long time now, what's to say that we could see the end of Bayer sensor technologies in this decade? I think surely this has to be near the end of its development cycle now, because there potentially is better sensor technologies in the labs for companies like Panasonic and Sony. Now, I know there is mentions of organic sensors, and I remember Panasonic releasing a dynamic range figures for its sensor on the development bed, and they claimed an incredible 29.2 stops of dynamic range. Now, currently in the Bayer sensor technologies that we're currently using, we're lucky to get 14 or 15 stops of dynamic range. So we're not talking about an incremental movement of dynamic range. We're talking about physically doubling the dynamic range. So this would allow maybe amateurs to miss the exposure by 3-4 stops and then salvage the image in post-production, or professionals shooting architecture or real estate photography and recording the view outside of the window and full detail inside the building. This would create a huge wealth of information on the single image captures, rather than expecting photographers to have to bracket and then post-produce. We also have global shutters on test beds. I think Sony call this the Pregius. I'm hopefully pronouncing that correctly. This is a way of having all sensor sites exposed exactly at the same time. No rolling exposure, no shutter distortion for movie recorders. We could see perhaps the end of the mechanical shutter in this decade to come. And certainly high ISO performance. Sony is still working on improving high ISO performance, an area of development that they call StarViz. They have sensors that will record usable information, mostly for security cameras at this current moment in time, simply by no more light than is emitted from the stars. And the benchmark here is being able to pull off information from a car number plate, so we can actually see that information with no street lights and no moonlight, just starlight. So I think the end of Bayer, and you'll probably hear sensor technologies that have been toyed with in the past but have never really borne any fruit, and that is vertical color separation sensors, so that each sensor site is responsive to both or all red, green, blue spectrums of light, not having one sensor site being receptive to either a red, green or blue, and then having that demosaicing process to create an RGB image in post-production. I think there is certainly great advantages to creating sharper images, even from lower resolution sensors, if we can see the end of that Bayer sensor technology and start moving into vertical color separation sensors. So to conclude my review here, is a lot of people say, you know, well, what exactly are you expecting from camera technologies, Mark? And I would say smaller, lighter, faster and more capable. I will always invest my own personal money in camera technologies which I can carry with less weight, smaller bags, and that are more capable, that allow me to shoot more subjects with less add-ons or features that I have to buy to increase the capability of that camera. To give you an example, if I compared to a full frame setup, if I take a very extensive APS-C camera setup with 5 lenses there, I can get that into just over 3.5 kilos. I can't go anywhere near approaching that weight saving at full frame at the moment, but I will always use full frame cameras at the moment for the image quality that they give me. But will that always be the case, or will I be able to achieve that level of image quality that I'm currently achieving with full frame now with APS-C in the years to come? And then who knows what full frame sensors will be able to deliver? Will there ever be a market for medium format if the image quality of full frame sensors carry on improving? So certainly, this is an area that I'm keen to explore in the year to come, and certainly I've invested in the Alpha 6600 and their 2 premium quality lenses that allows me to carry just a couple of premium lenses and travel much lighter. So another area that is of great interest to me, and if you probably check out my RX100 review, is this camera technology, just using a 1-inch sensor. Because it's using the stack sensor technology, it can achieve great things with just a small sensor. And that, remember, was delivered back in 2015 with that sensor technology, and Sony have carried on pushing the capabilities of that RX100 camera, so we can create images at 100 ISO that on the surface looked like it was captured with an interchangeable lens camera, much bigger camera. And so this that landscape image, this portrait image, was just captured on a 1-inch sensor. And the capabilities that arrived to this fixed lens camera in 2019 was the ability to do blackout free 20 frame per second panning on motorsports, and the only other camera that has that blackout free capability at this point in time is the A9 and A9 II cameras. To see that arrive in a fixed lens camera was certainly astounding in 2019, and allowed me to do really clever creative stuff like shooting this sequence of images at that one was captured at 90 frames per second, 20 megapixel images, 90 frames per second in the single burst shooting mode. Now, what about, and I've got no idea, I have to say I've got no idea whether Sony have got any plans to do this, but what if Sony had not finished with their RX lineup of cameras and sort of dissected in between their RX10, which is a full-size camera with a 24 to 600mm lens, f4 at the 600mm, and somewhere in between the RX100, which is a pocketable camera, wants to say that they don't go a 24 megapixel micro 4/3, 24 to 300mm equivalent f2.8 constant f2.8 lens with machine learning for depth control and night vision. Now, who would put their hands up in the market for one of those cameras? Even if you had no intentions of selling your interchangeable lens camera, I certainly would invest in one of these cameras. Obviously not pocketable, but certainly a whole camera system in a camera perhaps no bigger than say an Alpha 6400 camera. If the engineers could pull it off, I certainly think that is something that would drive a growing market in this area. Okay, so if you found my speculation, and I could be completely wrong on all of those fronts, but if you found my speculation useful and you are a current Alpha user, just make sure you head over to my website, www.markgaylor.com. I will continue to support the Alpha community with free downloads, free ebooks, hundreds of tutorial movies, so you can get the best performance out of any camera that is current or that Sony release into the future, I will try and support the Alpha community. If you do find it exceedingly valuable, there are donation links, but I'm more than happy for you to take those resources free of charge. If you're wanting a personal dialogue with me, you want to message me because you found things that I haven't covered in my hundreds of movies and my 300-page ebooks, then head over to my Patreon site. For as little as $2 a month, you can start messaging me and you will get a personal answer resolving your personal alpha problems with your cameras, and I will help you optimize your workflow. I'll even get involved in a photo critique service if you just up your monthly donation to $5 or $10 a month. Okay, so that concludes my 2020 Where To From Here movie. It's going to be an exciting decade. I can sense it. I certainly don't think the technology has matured and will stagnate, because that will certainly kill all of the imaging companies that are out and around today. But I don't think most of the leading manufacturers will rest on their laurels now. Certainly a company like Sony, I think they will push harder, faster, stronger in order to create technologies that we feel compelled to purchase. Okay, I'm Mark Gaylor, Sony Imaging Ambassador.